straight to the heart of the matter. Though we've entitled today's discussion, South Sudan, When War and Famine Collide, we're clearly aware that these are only two strands of a much more complicated situation in South Sudan, a much longer and convoluted history of conflict, oppression, and attempts to resolve those issues. One of the things that I wanted to kind of start by pointing out is that even though in the West we have a tendency to mark the struggle in South Sudan based on when we began to engage. So you hear about July 9th, 2011, you hear about July 9th, 2005, you hear about interventions such as Operation Lifeline Sudan in the late 80s and early 90s. But if you were to sit down with then Southerners, now South Sudanese, you would hear a different take on the arc of the struggle in South Sudan, and that arc is about a 200-year struggle for them to get to the place where they are. And it essentially starts with rule in that region by the Ottoman Empire, rule in that region by the Egyptians, rule in that region by the British colonial powers, and then rule in that region by Arabized Northerners situated in the post-independence government at Khartoum. But the reason why I wanted to bring that together is that all of those powers who ruled that region had one central principle in mind. And that central principle was that the region of the South, which is now South Sudan, was to be only a region for the extraction of natural resources, was to be only a region for the extraction of human resources, was not to be cultivated, was not to be integrated, was to be isolated, and was not to be developed. And that is essentially the beginning of the struggle that they had, which essentially made it a place designated for plunder. And successive governments in post-independence Khartoum made that very clear. One of the things that happened in that history, specifically around the second civil war in Sudan versus the South, obviously, was they designated it something that they termed in Arabic the Dar al-Harb, which means the abode of war, which was to say they were giving themselves a religious justification to freely plunder and decimate that area for themselves. And one of the things that we hear all the time in the West about Sudan is, and South Sudan now, religious justifications, regional justifications, ethnic and racial justifications, but all of these are veneers for essentially greed and the lust for power and resources by specific ruling entities in that country and in that region. The sad irony, essentially, of the contemporary moment is that though many Southerners sacrificed their lives to resist these forms of governance and founded the Sudanese People's Liberation Movement and Army, South Sudan has become once again the abode of war. This time, though, without the thin religious veil, in essentially a conflict that is a naked contest for wealth and for power, and again, not for the development and the cultivation of the people of that nation. This all reminded me of the African proverb which states that when the elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers. And I thought that it would be good for us to take that symbolic metaphor to look at who the symbolic elephants are, what their actions mean for the suffering of the people who are at the bottom of that conflict and who have long been ignored in this process. And I know that many of you are experts and have given great service to try to ameliorate the suffering of those people. And so to get us right into our panel, I wanted to go over to Ashley Kwarku, who's going to give us a readout from the USAID perspective about the human toll of the conflict and where we are right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Travis, and thanks to CSIS for organizing this. I just want to pick up on how Travis framed this and emphasized, yes, we aren't in a humanitarian catastrophe, but it is rooted in a political problem, a political crisis. And normally in a system of governance, we have rules for governing how political competition is going to take place. It takes place within a framework where people agree on the rules around that framework. And we don't have that kind of consensus in South Sudan. Instead, we have leaders who have decided to go outside of the peaceful rules of the game and to pursue their political objectives through violence that is destroying their country. So this is a humanitarian crisis of massive proportions, but it is rooted in this political crisis. So just to frame the humanitarian piece of this, we're talking about 2 million people who have fled the country around the neighboring regions. We have 2 more million people displaced inside of South Sudan, and 2,800 people are continuing to flee the country every day. So that's about 1 in 3 people who are displaced from their homes right now. By July, and that's really just around the corner, we estimate about 6 million people are going to be in need of life-saving or will face life-threatening hunger, and about 7.5 million people are going to need humanitarian assistance writ large. And just to put this last number in context, that's about 60% of South Sudan's pre-conflict population. So this is a massive impact on the overall population, displacement as well as humanitarian and food needs. And though we were pleased, as I'm sure many of you were, to see last week that parts of South Sudan have now been declared famine-free, or to be no longer in famine, we need to remember that the food security situation really remains dire, continues to deteriorate across the country. Just to say a word, USAID is helping to lead the U.S. government response to this humanitarian catastrophe. We've been working aggressively to help save as many lives as possible with our partners long before the famine declaration in February of this year, and we will continue to do so. We're reaching about 1.3 million people each month with life-saving assistance. But this is a really difficult and dangerous undertaking, and not just because we're in a conflict zone and there's lots of insecurity. There have been numerous deliberate and brazen attacks on humanitarian aid workers in South Sudan, attacks which are violations of international humanitarian law. 84 aid workers have been killed in South Sudan since the conflict began in December of 2013, and 17 of those have been since this year alone, so since January of this year. And that makes South Sudan the most deadly place in the world for humanitarian workers to operate. And that's really shocking if you think about conflicts that are going on all over the globe: Yemen, Iraq, Syria. So aside from insecurity, aside from, again, these willful attacks on humanitarian workers, we're also facing the direct, willful obstruction and intervention of the government of South Sudan in imposing bureaucratic impediments that inhibit our humanitarian actors from being able to access those people who need their assistance. It's a range of things, from imposing worker permits, fees, and NGO registration fees that really dramatically increase the cost of delivering humanitarian assistance. And then we see direct detention and extortion, harassment, really egregious acts to deter the delivery of the assistance that is going to save the lives of the people of this country. And the fact that the government is taking these actions to prevent this kind of life-saving assistance is really unconscionable. And the U.S. government expects that our assistance is going to reach the people that need it the most. And we are doing all we can to press all parties to allow humanitarian actors to function without restriction. finally, just to say a note about kind of the human cost that Travis referred to. I mean, you know, there was a UN survey done in 2015 looking at 4 protection of civilian sites. These are the sites where about 230,000 IDPs, internally displaced across the country, are sheltering. This survey conducted in 2015 of 4 sites in Juba, it reported that over 70% of women have been raped since the conflict began. 75% have witnessed someone else being raped. This is a weapon, a strategy of war at this point. It's a mass atrocity crime and largely perpetrated by soldiers and police. There has been complete impunity for these actions, and you know, we can anticipate, as long as that impunity reigns, as long as the conflict reigns, we'll see those kinds of strategies being utilized. So I feel like I'm often the doom and gloom voice in some of these discussions, but you know, we as the United States, we will continue to provide assistance. I think the humanitarian assistance and other assistance that we're providing is critical. It is saving lives, but it's really a drop in the bucket when we look at the scope and scale of the humanitarian needs, the civilian protection needs, and ultimately, again, going back to the remarks I made at the top, this is a political crisis and needs a political solution, and until the parties are willing to decide that this strategy of war is either too high a cost for their brothers and sisters, or it's ineffective for them if their goal ultimately is to gain power. Until they decide, we're going to continue to have these kinds of humanitarian needs. Thanks.
Thank you, Ashley. Having started with a current USG official, I thought it would make sense to follow that up by getting an honest perspective from a former senior USG official who's worked extensively on Africa and on the Sudans to talk about essentially where we are with U.S. engagement on South Sudan, whether we have policies in place that make sense for where we are in that country at this time, and then also to speak a little bit about regional actors, United Nations, IGAD, African Union, and others. So with that, I'll turn it over to Linda and team.
Great. As Travis was saying, I spent a long time in the U.S. government working on Sudan and then South Sudan and a lot of the neighboring countries. And so in some ways, I have a lot of sympathy and appreciation for the work that a lot of really hardworking people in government are doing right now to ensure that despite what we've seen as a pretty depressing lack of attention on this very important crisis, aid continues to flow. People continue to make sure that they're advocating for continued assistance and support to the people of South Sudan, even in the face of what's going on with their government. That said, South Sudan is not just a political crisis, a crisis of political leaders in the country not owning up to their responsibilities and not taking care of their people. What we are also seeing is a crisis of international leadership. And that's pretty dramatic. The United States knows that we gave ourselves a lot of credit for different important milestones in South Sudan's recent history, from the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in 2005 to the Declaration of Independence for the new country that was finally born. We know that over decades, we've seen church leaders in the United States, and we've seen people from the right and left come together to actually support the people of South Sudan and make it a cause that has been a very American cause. What we're seeing now with the lack of attention, I think, is frankly depressing. And the idea of abdicating the role of U.S. historic leadership to basically saying it's only the responsibility of the parties on the ground is something that we should challenge, I think, actively, especially folks that are in this room working on these issues. Next, Travis mentioned the fact that it's not just the United States. We've got the United Nations, again, biggest peacekeeping force on the planet. And we've also got the African Union, again, most dangerous place in the world for humanitarian assistance, famine, a civil war, and yet these bodies and these institutions whose main job it is to actually make sure that they're intervening appropriately and actually calling countries and leaders and individuals on the wrongs that they're committing have basically also stepped back and said, we will provide assistance or protection within our role, but because of issues of sovereignty or complexities, we're stepping back, and I think what we see across the board is a lot of people sort of waiting for the other, for somebody else to step up and actually take action on the crisis. When we look at humanitarian workers and deliveries being detained and actually obstructed, that's actually considered a human rights violation. And yet, it's not the language that we use to speak about it. We haven't seen the African Union do more than condemn. We haven't seen the UN stand up and say, actually, these are crimes against humanity. There have been many investigations, but I think that these are sort of the language and the things that people need to start talking about. There was one report where we talked about the potential of ethnic cleansing. It's sort of reached past the point where we need to go a little bit further. One of the things that we've seen with the neighboring countries as well is this idea that they're accepting refugees. So I think, you know, Uganda has been an amazing recipient of South Sudanese refugees. But Uganda has been a major problem when you talk about actually coming to a resolution of the political crisis. And so on the one hand, again, you see this willingness to engage on how do we accept people and deal with the outflow of the problem, but nobody actually stepping up in a leadership role and willing to take on the really root causes of what the crisis, of why the crisis is continuing. And until that happens, we know that the suffering in these communities is only going to get worse. And so I think one of the challenges for all of us is to actually figure out at what point are we willing to actually really push forward aggressively and say, okay, we've let this go on for over 4 years now, this war. The last war was over 20 years. Maybe this is the time to actually say enough is enough and actually take some more concerted actions to making sure that the people who are responsible for these atrocities are actually brought to more justice.
Thank you, Linda. With Linda giving us pretty much an overview of the bilateral U.S. engagement in the region and on South Sudan specifically, I wanted to turn to Steve Vigil, who essentially is joining us via satellite. It may not technically be a satellite, but I will refer to it in that way. Steve, given your background in UN peacekeeping in South Sudan, could you talk to us a little bit about some of the challenges you've seen there, some of the issues with UNMISS, some of the challenges in terms of the protection of civilians, which Ashley and Linda have talked about, and then also perhaps a little bit from your perspective on the nexus between what the UN mission in South Sudan is trying to do related to conflict and how that might be hindered or helped by issues of governance in South Sudan.
Right. Some notes that I was going to go off, and I think I could address some of that, much of that within the notes. And forgive me, I'm actually going to be kind of reading off of it just in the interest of time, because I feel like if not, I could kind of stray, and I understand we're limited time here, so I wanted to keep on that. First off, Travis, thank you, and I'd like to thank the Center for Strategic and International Studies for hosting this panel, and specifically Ambassador McCarthy and the Diversity and National Security Project. I guess the name just changed in the last couple of days, so it sounds good. I like it. And another thing, just in terms of what I'm going to say, I really want to preface that these are really my views and not the views of the UN or any of my other previous employers, whether in Sudan, South Sudan, or elsewhere. I'm going to share my thoughts on my experience in Sudan and South Sudan during the periods of the 2010 national election and 2011 referendum and immediately post-independence. During part of this period, I coordinated a security working group in the UN mission focused on electoral and referendum-related security incidents. I think it's important to look at this particular period in relation to where South Sudan is today, and hopefully that this will contribute to some sort of understanding of steps that can be taken towards ending the civil war and moving towards peace. I think a lot of the roots of what's already been discussed on the panel were already visible during this period. And for me coming to South Sudan during that time, having not had any experience in Sudan before, there was a lot, and my understanding of what I'd heard from before coming challenged the situation on the ground, challenged a lot of what I understood before I got there. I think some of the roots of the current conflict can be seen when looking at the 2010 Sudanese national elections. The key element I observed during this period was that the leadership in South Sudan seemed very willing to use violence to achieve its goals, even while participating in a democratic process to determine the future of South Sudan. Additionally, it was immediately clear that there was a deep division within the SPLM/A that predated the CPA period that contributed to the violence. During the 2010 elections, the leadership in Juba used the SPLA to interfere, often violently, to ensure that their preferred candidates won. We had many incidents of candidates being detained and beaten. Voter intimidation was common, armed soldiers entering polling stations. We even had a case of SPLA soldiers burning ballots for the Western Equatoria gubernatorial race after it had become clear that the candidate backed by the SPLM leadership in Juba had lost. At this period, the SPLA was moving, the military was moving soldiers from one region to another that they considered there was a chance that the non-Juba backed candidate would lose. And many people were observing that they were attempting to secure the election, and I think it was actually more a move to secure the position that they wanted for the future. During the CPA period, South Sudan was a violent place. Cattle raiding contributed greatly to the weekly death toll, as did clashes between local civilian villagers and SPLA patrols. Cattle raiding, which is a rite of passage in some cultures in the region, but in the period that I was there, that aspect had been lost as rival military commanders, politicians, and other actors exerted increased control. Raids were being coordinated with mobile technology and done using automatic weapons. Cattle, women, and children were taken in raids that caused death tolls on average of 10 to 20 people a week, and oftentimes much more than that. And this was during the period of the CPA. SPLA patrols in the field were not well supported and were in many cases living off the land. This put them in direct conflict with local villagers in the areas they were patrolling. The SPLA activities that I observed in some parts in South Sudan more closely resembled cattle raiding or moves to secure territory. And in fact, the SPLA during this period in some parts of the country was moving as if they were still in warfare. What I observed was that the violence in South Sudan did not happen in isolation. Violence seemed coordinated, intentional, and used as a means to an end. It was used to ensure a favorable outcome in an election. It was used to increase territorial control. It was used to ensure grazing land for cattle for one group at the expense of another. It was used to intimidate journalists, civil society, aid workers, and even UN staff. At one point when I was there, there was an issue where the South Sudan police had detained the head of human rights for the United Nations, and arrested, jailed, and beaten him, and charged him with false charges for counterfeiting. I think that's important to note as we're in the discussion. It's even the head of the human rights for the UN was being intimidated. I mean, that says a lot about what was going on. Much of the violence that was taking place in the pre-referendum period seemed to be motivated by establishing political and territorial control and to determine who would run South Sudan post-independence. Friends and colleagues from smaller or less powerful tribes were concerned at the expansion of Dinka and Nuer communities in other areas, seemingly with the support of the SPLA or large militia groups such as the White Army. Some shared concerns that post-independence the violence would increase and lead to war. These were concerns that South Sudanese colleagues were sharing with me as we were running into the referendum period. And even post-independence, several colleagues said, now the real conflict begins. Who's going to run the country? And that was particularly acute when I was in Juba, hearing that from colleagues from the Equatorias that were concerned at the large number of Dinka soldiers and Nuer soldiers that were in Juba. During the referendum period, the political leadership in South Sudan tried to display a more unified front and invested heavily in reaching out to citizens to support for independence. The people of South Sudan were enthusiastic and hopeful that an independent South Sudan would pursue nation building, reconcile its differences, develop infrastructure to support growth, and work together to build a nation. In the run-up to the referendum, the government strongly supported media and civil society groups that were educating South Sudanese about the democratic process and governance. Following independence, those hopes were never realized. What did happen was a continuation of what was happening before independence. The struggle for power continued. Khartoum was once again to blame for any ills and the lack of infrastructure. And the leadership in South Sudan continued to use violence to achieve its goals, indifferent to the suffering of the citizens they were meant to serve. And incidentally, the media and civil society groups that were previously supported became enemies of the state as they began to report on corruption and advocated for more inclusive and transparent government. And recently, in speaking to a former colleague, one of the things that she commented on was that she felt that during the referendum period that the leadership really intentionally pulled the wolves over the eyes of the South Sudan citizens, that it wasn't ever, that she felt that they were given limited options in terms of the choices, and it was really all about the leadership, kind of maintaining control. When looking back at 2010 elections and the 2011 referendum, I feel that in a rush to a politically expedient solution before deadlines laid out in the CPA, important steps involving peace, reconciliation, social cohesion, and promoting and unifying identity as South Sudanese on a national scale did not happen, despite the presence of multiple actors from the international community and the will and desire of the people of South Sudan. Although there was a great deal of investment to ensure that the elections and the referendum took place, not enough was done on the front end to ensure that they would yield a viable solution to the violence that has been plaguing the people of South Sudan for generations. The creation of a new independent state was not enough to ensure an end to violence and the first steps towards peace. The process that led to the independence of South Sudan had limited, and I think this is a comment in speaking with many of my colleagues, former colleagues, that their feeling was that the process that led to the independence of South Sudan had limited engagement from the wider South Sudanese society. It was primarily made up of those who had a role politically, militarily, or both during the Sudanese Civil War. Many of the conflicts that occurred in the Sudanese Civil War carried over into the birth of South Sudan as an independent nation without resolution. The same actors are now once again in conflict and charged with bringing an end to the war. It would seem that without greater political engagement from all South Sudanese society, ensuring that there are many people at the table, and real political will from the international community, that the next process is doomed to fail as well. And
Steve,
may
I chime in here just quickly? In the interest of time,
Sure.
if you might give us one final comment, and then I'm going to move to Mario.
Yeah, well, my final comment was thank you. That was it. But I just incidentally, I'd really like to, and just speaking to the UN and particularly to the time I was there, I think even now we're seeing it's the largest UN mission on the ground. But I also think we need to look at during this period, the mission was never adequately supported. And I want to get into I'm supporting. I definitely have a lot of issues of how things were done. And I think in a certain context that there was a bit of enabling, well, not a bit, that the UN mission at some points enabled some of the leadership in South Sudan without really having the will to step up and push back against it. But I also think that has a lot to do with just the general political will of the international community in general. The UN is an easy punching bag when things go wrong. But at the end of the day, the UN responds to the will of the member states, and particularly the permanent members of the Security Council. And I think that if you look in other cases around the world, when the members of the permanent, when the P5 come together and make a decision that we're going to move on something, and when other countries step in and step up as well and follow their lead, you see outcomes that are much more, I mean, you see actual processes moving. I think right now we're in a situation where things are just stuck. Everyone's stepping back and waiting for somebody else to take the lead. Unfortunately, I think if we keep waiting, then all we're going to see is a continued deterioration of the situation in South Sudan. And in particular, I guess my last point would be, and maybe it wasn't strong enough in what I said, but a lot of the violence that was happening when I was there was really definitely targeted. I felt like a lot of it was based on moving different groups that were not as powerful off their land. It was about maintaining control. And now I think you're seeing a much more accelerated version of that. And what's happening, areas of South Sudan that were not experiencing great amounts of violence when I was there are now the epicenters for violence. So
Excellent.
that was my final point.
Thank you for the insight, Steve. I just want to make one administrative point again, that if you guys have questions developing in your head or that you've scratched on notes that you already have, this would be the time to call or to raise your hands to receive the note cards for our Q&A, which will ensue right after Mario gives his remarks. And so just really quickly, after having that rundown from Steve, I wanted to turn to Mario Bowl, who is a former lecturer at the John Garang Memorial University in South Sudan, to give us his insights, not only as a South Sudanese, but also as one who's focused on politics and governance in the region, as well as refugee issues. So we'll turn it over to you, Mario.
Thank you very much. I thank the CISIS and Ambassador McCarthy for inviting me. Well, actually, I came back from South Sudan. I was there for 3 years. And from there, I was born there. But I'm also an American. So just to put that across. Also, I'm not going to speak for the government or for the rebel or from anybody that is fighting each other, including my own community. I will have to be independent. Once you live outside, like me, I grew up in a refugee camp. I was raised by the UN, United Nations. I was in northern Kenya before I came here. I came here as part of the Lost Boys group. So I'm one of the former Lost Boys from Sudan, now South Sudan. Now I'm not lost again. With the issue of South Sudan, as mentioned on the introduction, South Sudan is very complicated. It's a very complicated country, like another country in the world, say like the US. But sometimes one doesn't know until once you get to something else. I did not even know that South Sudan was such a complicated country when I was here, until I went there and spent 3 years. I will speak only 2 things. The country itself, I mean, why it is like that, and the NGO role, as mentioned. South Sudan, like another African countries, did not get independent from any European colonies. It got its independence from a neighboring country, and that is the Sudan. That neighboring country, Sudan, has a deep-seated interest, an interest that could go on up to 50 years, 100 years, who knows. The interest of Sudan, that South Sudan left, is to make sure that South Sudan become a failed state. It's actually one of the reasons why, ethnicity become an issue in South Sudan. There are more than 60 tribes in that country, in that young nation, more than 60. Each of these tribes has its own interests in how the country should be actually run. It's something that I didn't know. Some of friends of South Sudan, I do not know. But it's one of the reasons why the country is like the way it is today. Coming to the role of NGO, because I'm not going to dwell on that very much. We could go on and on and on and on. I was a lecturer at the John Garang based in Bor. Bor is my hometown. That's the town of my tribe. And in South Sudan, it's not like here. You spend your time talking to people, that's how you actually get the public opinion. South Sudanese are very different. The way they are actually playing the card of the NGOs is something that we don't know. And most of my colleagues talk about that. There are now a lot of refugees in northern Uganda, northern Kenya, in Ethiopia, and even in the Sudan that we left. The NGOs are doing a good job. I would also one day would love to work for the NGO. I was raised by the NGO. I was educated by the UN. There's no problem with the NGO. Welcome to me personally. I appreciate that. But two, there are things that need to be observed with the NGO. I thank my colleague for bringing up all the things. In 2013, when the conflict broke out, my home area of Bor is in Upper Nile, was completely destroyed. Some people ran to northern Uganda, others ran to Kenya, and some crossed the Nile to Barkazal. There's a place called Warel, where my friend Benjamin Machar come from. These people are still there up to today. They don't want to come back to their villages. I was in my village. I used to live in the village. They don't want to come back simply because the NGO, the UN that is actually helping South Sudanese, is telling them not to go back. Once they do so, they will never qualify for the benefits, the food items and then the non-food items. The same NGO is actually coming here and saying that the government of Sudan is actually making it impossible for people to go back to their villages. This is what I have observed. It's an independent thinking. I'm not speaking for the government or another group. This is what I have seen. Part of my family members are in that camp. 2013, well, it happened. What can you do? You cannot change the past. I asked them to come back, but they know that because the rule of UN says you cannot be an IDP in your own district. In my hometown of Bor, there are more than 7,000 ethnic Nuers in Bor town. They don't want to go back to their own areas. So this is how it is. I'm not trying to blame the NGOs, as I put it, because I was supported by the NGO. But this is the card that is being played now between the two. With the governance, as mentioned, the leadership of SPLM has never changed ever since. It's been like that since 1983, 84, same leadership government. When they disagree, they think that everybody in the country disagree. And you could talk of President Kiir, Riek Machar, the former deputy. When they unite, they believe that all the tribes are united. Now they're fighting each other. They think that everybody should fight each other because they don't like each other now. But once they come together later on, they will assume that peace has come because they are together. This is one of the reasons why I say South Sudan is more complicated than we think we don't live there. So thank you. I'm being fresh here, which is very good. I would actually be very happy if anybody asked me later on. But I lived there for 3 years, by the way. I'm not reading from line or talking using social media. I travel around and I've seen this with my own eyes. I've been part of the issue. So thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Mario. Our first question, I think we can pose to the entire panel who would like to speak to it, but it is specifically referenced to a point that Linda was making earlier, and that is the role that the U.S. government played in the birthing of the independence of South Sudan, and what specifically the U.S. should do to help bring about a political resolution in the conflict.
So, and I was, I'd like to say that I've been working on South Sudan since 2002. And so I saw the CPA period and also, which are the Bush years, and then I also was up close and personal because I started the National Security Council under Obama during the referendum period when we were actually talking about how we would bring independence about. And so I will say that, during this time period, there was a very strong realization that the terms of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement had not been met fully. I think there was a strong recognition that the 2010 elections were not where they needed to be. I think that we knew that there were a lot of unresolved issues, and that we didn't yet have a government that felt like they could stand up on their own, and that was largely dependent on international assistance, even as at that point in time oil revenues were high. At the same time, when we went around and did surveys and checks with the people around the country and in neighboring countries, you have to remember the referendum vote happened not just within South Sudan, but with the diaspora community that had been displaced for many, many years, and that were excited and optimistic about their future. And we heard very clearly from people that they didn't want Western countries taking over their nation. They wanted separation. They wanted the vote on time, and that they thought they could sort through these other things by themselves. And so what happens is, as the U.S. government, we went through this wrestling internal match about, is it paternalistic to tell people that no, you are not ready for that yet. Actually, you should be a protectorate. You need to wait. There are some other steps that need to take place. Or do we say, no, this is your right, as was negotiated under a peace agreement, but that we will be there as the United States to continue to support you going forward. Their hindsight is always 2020. There was a lot of concern that if the referendum did not happen on time, that there would have been a civil war that started right then. And so there was a call that was made to move forward with the referendum, but to have dedicated budgets for South Sudan, both at the State Department and at USAID, and even for defense, to make sure that this was something that the United States would remain focused on. There was also a decision that even after separation, the role of the U.S. Special Envoy would continue to move forward. There had been a thought before that the role of the envoy was only to negotiate the Comprehensive Peace Agreement and to help with the Troika, which was Norway, UK, and the U.S. and the UN, and then move out from there. But at that point in time, we said there's going to be a lot of other things to resolve, and so the United States needed to remain involved. And so that was sort of the special relationship that continued with the United States with South Sudan before and after the referendum took place, and an understanding that a lot of the terms of the CPA and a lot of the challenges would continue even after. And that's sort of, with that understanding moving forward, that's the period of time that we're in now. And so the question is, what are the choices and the decision-making that happens now that we're in this period where you actually have to deal with a new country, but you know that they're not actually protecting their civilian rights, the citizens' rights?
Thank you. The next question touches on, I think, mostly Ashley's presentation. And this questioner is curious about the impact on U.S. foreign aid in South Sudan since the departure and re-engagement by USAID, the departure of some of the implementing partners who were there right up in the lead up to the conflict, and how that may have impacted our overall mission, objectives, and achievement of our goals in South Sudan.
Sure. So, I mean, USAID continues to be in force in South Sudan, to be actively implementing programs to respond to the crisis. We did kind of a revamp of what we were doing there after the 2013 violence broke out. We had primarily in line with Linda was articulating, we had a mission to support the development of the South Sudanese as a state, the country, and a lot of programs geared in that way. And there was obviously a fundamental shift when the context changed and we emerged into a humanitarian crisis beginning in 2013, and our programs adjusted accordingly. And certainly after last year's violence, there was an impact on primarily international personnel that needed to leave the country. But we have returned USAID personnel back into our missions. Our partners are back. We are implementing programs actively, and so I think the message is that we're going to continue to do that. We're going to continue to be there to mitigate the impacts of this conflict to the extent that we can.
Thank you. Mario, there's a question that I think maybe you might be best placed to answer, since we talked about this before we came up onto the stage, and that is, what has been the role of the oil industry in particular, especially in relation to foreign investment in oil in South Sudan, and the ways in which those competing factors have contributed to the conflict?
Yeah. Well, oil is the major income for the country today. 90-something percent, 90 actually percent of the government revenue come from the oil. It's one of the reasons why the economy of South Sudan is said to have collapsed, because the oil prices in the whole world actually is down. So South Sudan, even though it owns oil, is not playing a major role in that oil industry. It's being actually treated as a junior partner. There are oil companies that are there, BP is there, the Chinese companies are there. So it makes things more complicated than otherwise actually thought. These oil companies are displacing people from their own villages. You don't see this, on the media unless you actually go there yourself to see that. So oil is doing a good thing because it's the only source of income, but at the same time, he's the one that is responsible for most of the problem today. I don't know whether I have answered you correctly.
Thank you. Another question relates to essentially vestiges of the British colonial legacy in South Sudan. And since I spoke about that a little bit in my opening remarks, I will try and answer to that. I think clearly the answer is yes. When you look at the fact that Sudan and South Sudan were essentially administered as two different countries under the British colonial administration, which was from 1899 to 1956, they had in the 1920s what they called the closed-door ordinances. And the closed-door ordinances essentially stated that people from southern Sudan would not be allowed to enter northern Sudan, and that people from northern Sudan would not be allowed to enter southern Sudan. No exchange in business, no exchange culturally, no exchange at all. And then they decided that the north was more advanced, more prepared to be integrated into the modern world. They allowed Islam to continue to flourish there. They allowed the Arabic language to be the predominant language in terms of education and commerce. And in the South, they decided that they would bring in missionaries from the UK, educate them primarily in English, and then their plan all along was to integrate the South into what they called British East Africa, which would have essentially been a combining of that territory with Kenya and Uganda. And so they never intended for the nation actually to be unified. In addition to that, they made a decision that the South was backwards and it wasn't ready to join the modern world, which, as I stated earlier, was essentially the same position that every entity that had governed South Sudan had. And then you follow that up, January 1st, 1956, independence comes, and then the British just disappear, essentially jamming together two nations that for over 50 years they never administered as one nation, and then no one could figure out why they couldn't get along. So clearly that legacy is problematic for what we see happening in South Sudan now. Another question I had for you guys as we prepare to close is a pretty broad question. And some of the answers that we've given already may cover some of this, but I will try it anyway. And that is, given all that all of you have shared, how would you assess the capacity and the political will of the U.S. and regional and international actors in this moment to meet the crises in South Sudan? You know, the U.S. is known for its can-do attitude, but in this moment of political crisis at home and abroad, do you think that the international order is prepared to resource and can properly coordinate an effort where we can't seem to find the leverage points to bring the warring parties to the table? And perhaps we can close on that question. And each of you who chooses to chime in can do so.
Sure, I'll start. So I actually, I tend to be an optimist, and maybe part of that is if some of you know that U2's been going around the country on their tour. They performed in Washington D.C. on World Refugee Day, particularly to raise awareness and attention, I think, to issues like South Sudan, where people from the left and from the right can actually agree that we don't like human suffering as Americans, that we actually care about it a lot, and that even with political jockeying and attempts to cut foreign assistance bills, the one thing that you do see pretty consistently is the Hill coming forward and saying, no, we don't like famine, we don't want people to starve, we do want a solution to this crisis. I think what we're seeing with the international community right now, and this is why I call it a crisis of leadership, is that nobody wants to step up and take the lead. That doesn't mean that we're not pouring billions of dollars of resources into South Sudan, and that doesn't mean that people don't care that other people are suffering. And so in that sense, the fact that we're still willing to spend the money, the fact that we're still willing to be engaged is absolutely encouraging to me, because what you often end up seeing is people saying, we don't really care what's going on in that faraway place. So we've got an essential first step for the world community right now, in that people are willing to actually resource this. What they are lacking right now is, how do we stop it? How do we end this fighting? What's the real solution? What are our options? Have we exhausted all of them? And it's a failure of creativity. It's really about the region, the African Union, neighboring countries standing up and saying, you know what, we have an illegitimate government right now that has violated all sorts of international norms. We're not just going to stand by and let them to continue to do so. And it's, the P5, Chinese oil workers have been killed in this crisis. They've had to shut down production multiple times. They're losing money right now. They should have an interest in this. Russia, we've seen sort of terrible stories about Russia funneling arms and equipment into South Sudan that were aiding and abetting in this war. Well, I think the international community has been very clear to Russia that right now we don't really like what you're doing. There's a lot of movement and momentum and work that can happen in the UN Security Council. There's a lot of work that the African Union, now that it's got its leadership together, that was not the case several months ago, where they were still struggling with a lot of leadership issues. The African Union should now be able to step forward. They've got a mediation team from IGAD and the neighboring countries, and the US government itself is putting billions and has already invested billions of dollars into this, as has the UK and Norway. This is something that, given the money and given the fact that everybody agrees that this is not right, what's happening, it's not as hard as it needs to be. We need to actually just put pressure on all of these institutions to say, stand up for what you actually believe in, stop making this more difficult than it has to be, and start putting pressure on these leaders to do the right thing.
Thank you, Linda. You want to go ahead, Ashley?
No, I just, want to emphasize that the U.S. government continues to care and invest deeply in what is happening in South Sudan. It's always been an issue that has garnered, bipartisan support, and I think we can anticipate that same level of commitment going forward.
Excellent. Steve, did you want to provide some final comments on where we go from here?
Yeah, I mean, just following up on Linda and Ashley's statement. I don't see that this is, I think that all the elements are there. And we've seen before when the international community comes together with regional actors. We've seen that we could come together and bring about a solution to what seems to be an intractable problem. I was in Sierra Leone and Liberia in the early 2000s, and people thought that was hell on earth, and it was, But 2 years after the end of the war and civil war in Sierra Leone, I was standing in Freetown talking with local colleagues from different areas, and you didn't feel like you were in a place of war. There was people stepped in. There was actual reconciliation process. There was accountability. There was leadership. But and I think on that note, I think one of the thing that's lacking the most right now for me is just the political will to step up and take a leadership position, because all the elements are there. And this is something that we could do. It is an incredibly complicated situation. It is a very sad and tragic situation that's getting worse by the day. But this isn't the first time that this has happened. And we've seen when we could get together and take action in a unified manner that we could bring about resolution of these types of problems.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Steve. Only fitting that we close with our South Sudanese panelist, Mario. Closing thoughts.
Yeah, I would love to see the U.S. continue support peace in South Sudan. This is one of the best road now between on South Sudan-Uganda border. That road was built actually by the United States. That is the only best road in the whole country. So I would love to see United States doing that. But with the international community as a whole, I would also love to see the international community, support the peace and, reconciliation. But what I don't actually want the international community to do is to take over the country through the enemies. We have seen this in Congo. UN has been in Congo for nearly 60 years. Congo is still a mess. If you invite this foreign national to come and take over South Sudan will also continue to be at a mess for another 60 years. So we want good intentions and also prayers from the international community, but not to send in troops to go and, one would say it would be a clear, an overt violation of national sovereignty. South Sudanese, they're like Ethiopians, they're like Sudanese that they left. So they need to be advised, they need to be told. But you don't need an army from another part of the world, because UN doesn't speak one voice. UN is not very democratic on its own. So you cannot invite the whole mankind, if you will, to come and tell you what to do. That would be very difficult.
Thank you for that, Mario, and that allows us to close almost at 10:30 on the dot. Thanks to our panelists. Please give them a round of applause. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to CSIS for hosting us this morning.